So I'm delighted today to be joined by Chuck Farrer, who is a former squadron leader for the US Navy's SEAL Team 6. He served the US government and intel communities as a counterterrorism and military contractor. Chuck is also a New York Times bestselling author and has reported from Afghanistan and presently covers the war in Ukraine as a host for the Maria Report. We'll ask him to describe that in a minute because that's an incredible resource for understanding more about the conflict. And he's also a special correspondent for the Kiev Post. Chuck, welcome.
Jonathan, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you finally.
It's an absolute pleasure. We're going to cover a whole range of issues, but let's just sort of get that out of the way and describe what the Maria Report is, because when I discovered it, it's an incredible resource for those who want to understand what's happening in the Ukraine war. How do people access that?
It is Twitter's longest running, continuously running space. We are at Maria, MRIYA Report, REPORT. It came together as this kind of collective, this sort of anarchistic group of people all around the world. We broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've done so since the invasion started, and we have 24-hour news analysis, cultural reporting from Ukraine. We've also been lucky to have guests from the Helsinki Commission. We have had generals like Ben Hodges and Australian General Mick Ryan. They've all come on and shared their lights with us. I'm very happy to be there, and I do a show twice a week, roundup of the latest developments on the battlefield, and that is called Bullet Points on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
And this is on Twitter, as they still call it, or X, as the proprietor would now like us to call it. And I think what's important here, because this sort of leads into the topic we're going to talk about, it is a bipartisan space. Sometimes you will get some fairly acrimonious debates there, but you have people from both sides of the aisle, Republicans, Democrats, Brits, Australians, people from the global South. There's people from all over, all different political persuasions, but the one thing they have in common is their support for Ukraine and a recognition that Ukraine is fighting for its survival, its freedom, its liberty, and the right to practice a democratic existence, something the Russians are trying to expunge and destroy. How important is it that there are spaces like that and spaces like this where people from different political persuasions can come together and actually try to form an objective view on something like Ukraine's struggle?
Yeah, it's really refreshing for me as an American to see people coming together without acrimony. We can have differing opinions politically, but as you said, we are all in for Ukraine preserving its precious liberty and its developing democracy. It's what we all see, and we have a number of hosts, volunteers who all bring their own special expertise to the program, their own points of view. What's fascinating to me is that this shoestring organization now functions like a 24-hour international news network. We get reports directly from the front line, Ukrainian combatants who are on the zero line, humanitarian efforts, political and military opinions from some of the highest levels. It's been an amazing journey, and as someone who started out in college radio a million years ago, sometimes it still feels like that, but we've come a long way, and like I said, we're the longest continuously running space on X, and we're going to keep that up.
And it's incredibly important because what we see now unfolding in Ukraine is, I mean, we were talking about this before the recording started. What's unfolding in Ukraine is horrific and obscene, in fact, and almost everything that Russia does constitutes a war crime. They are sending so-called glide bombs into Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv. These are incredibly destructive, but well, you can't even say they're really targeted. They're just sent into particular districts, usually civilian districts, usually almost always civilian districts. So there's very little sort of targeting going on, but hugely destructive. They have a terrible both physical and psychological toll. Russia's doing this day in, day out, and yet we have become almost inured to it. And the mainstream media tends not to cover, unless something really major happens or there's some huge atrocity, it doesn't even seem to make the analysis of the papers. What's your gut feeling there, apart from sort of outrage? How do we turn this around and get people to understand the sheer scale and intensity of the criminality that is taking place?
Well, for example, Russia recently sent one of its more highly developed cruise missiles, and it slammed into a pediatric hospital on the fourth floor. That was not an accident. That was not collateral damage. That was a group of targeteers in Moscow entering the 8-digit grid coordinate for a children's hospital, loading a programmed missile into a strategic bomber, which flew over the Caspian Sea, let that weapon go. And you can't find a more prima facie war crime than slamming a cruise missile into a children's hospital. Every link of that kill chain was an individual war crime. The person who put their finger on the map, identified the children's hospital, wrote down the coordinates, the sergeant who programmed it into the missile, the pilot who flew that operation, the bombardier who opened the bomb doors, everyone is a war criminal. And this hasn't happened once. And you might forgive some people in the West from being oversaturated with it because that was the 1,500th hospital or clinic that has been deliberately targeted in Ukraine. The scale and the magnitude of the barbarity, it's off the charts. And as we speak right now, neighborhoods in Kharkiv are being slammed with glide bombs. They are targeting apartment buildings. They target high-density urban population centers. And Putin has demonstrated, and we can talk a little bit later about why he does this, but he deliberately targets Ukrainian population centers. He has a tactical reason for doing it, but high on his list of benefits is to terrorize the Ukrainian people.
And all this leads to the idea that Putin, why is he still doing this? Why is it purely for his own survival? Or does he still think, despite all the evidence that we're seeing, does he still think he is winning and can win and can extract some kind of what he would define as a victory from this situation? It's a two-barrel question, because if that's the case, do we have a strategy to persuade him that he is not winning and that he cannot win?
Well, unfortunately, there seems to be a disconnect in the highest levels of national command authority in the United States. Our national security apparatus and our national security advisor constantly worries and frets and misapprehends Russian red lines. Jake Sullivan seems to be a person who fears Russian escalation. I'd ask Mr. Sullivan, if someone is pumping cruise missiles into a children's hospital, how much more do you expect them to escalate? What are you afraid of? We hear constantly about Russian red lines, and even when we don't hear about them, they frame the reporting on the war. To me, the bright shining red line that separates a criminal act from genocide is attacking hospitals. It is deporting Ukrainian children in their hundreds of thousands from Ukraine. That's genocide. Let's talk about the red lines that Putin has crossed and not the red lines that we fear. All that Ukraine asks for are the minimum weapons that are necessary for national survival and also to protect their own troops and facilitate, rather than defensive combat, the offensive operations that will free up Ukrainian terrain. These are obvious things. Why they don't occur, Jonathan, you have me.
Well, we're going to come to the election in a minute because I think it's incredibly important to try and listen out and even put the candidates of the forthcoming election on the spot to get them to define what their vision of Ukrainian victory is. But we'll come to those criteria in just a minute, because Ukraine has made an extraordinary move in the last couple of weeks, and that is to mount a counteroffensive on the territory of Russia. And rather than being pinned down by the slow attritional warfare that Russia would like Ukraine to engage in, the non-mobile, extremely intense and barbaric, where it's force of numbers, not necessarily precision, that gives an advantage, Ukraine has created a space where it can execute a much more mobile form of warfare. So first of all, let's tackle that, the Kursk counteroffensive, and what opportunities it's opened up for Ukraine.
Well, I think a decision was made at the highest levels in the Ukrainian command structure that if they were able to create the preconditions necessary for offensive warfare, and I'll just very briefly touch on them, by no means covering them all, you need air defense dominance over your own troops, right, to secure your troops from Russian air attack and secure your lines of communication and supply. You need the strategic element of surprise, and you're also going to need some modicum of, if not air superiority, then at least air parity, so that your own aircraft can come in and prosecute deeper targets against your adversary. I think they looked at the entire battlefield. They are still fighting what's essentially an asymmetrical fight, and they wanted to attack where Russia was weak and it was not strong. The other thing that the Ukrainians realized, and you just pointed it out, the Russians are not good with dynamic situations. They're not good with fluid battle conditions. They like to grind away at a target day after day. So with all of these considerations in mind, the Ukrainians looked not east, where the locus of combat is, but north. And in one of the greatest military surprises in the 21st century, they assembled all of their troops, upwards of 10,000 troops, including 3 battalions of Special Operations Forces, and they burst across the frontier. And in 8 days, they captured more terrain in Russia than Russia has captured in Ukraine in the last 8 months. So this was a huge move, and it has resonated also in the information space, which was vitally important to Ukraine as well.
And this is, I mean, we'll come to that and its significance for the election, because it seems to have caused an uptick in media coverage of the Ukraine war, but it also seems to have prompted an uptick in people on both sides of the aisle, the electorate in the US, actually sort of changing their views and increased support for Ukraine and for supplying Ukraine. So it's an extraordinary psychological move in that sense, or political move. On the other side, you have a lot of analysts, and we were discussing this before reporting today, hitting record button. You've got analysts even today just saying, okay, well, if you lose Pokrovsk and you gain some territory in Kursk, well, have you really gained anything? Which I think is a complete misreading of the situation. It seems to me that Kursk is a seismic shock to the Russian regime and inflicts a huge blow on Russia's strongman leader, who appears no longer so strong or in control. It may even prompt him to take some desperate actions, such as mobilization. What's your view on these aspects of Ukraine's offensive, which so many analysts seem to be missing?
Well, I think you've named the last factors that piled on in the Ukrainian calculus, and that was, if we punched through Russian lines in Donetsk and we pushed them back 30 kilometers or so, it wouldn't attract anyone's attention. But we've penetrated 45 or 50 kilometers into Russia itself. We've taken approximately 1,000 square kilometers, some estimates 1,600 kilometers, at least in contested territory. And what impressed me, we got to see the Ukrainian Air Force carrying out strikes, aviation strike missions, and close air support over Russian airspace. So much has to change for that to have happened. You had to keep Russian air superiority fighters at bay. You had to dominate the air defense situation. And the cherry on top of the sundae was, it is enormously embarrassing to Vladimir Putin, who doesn't acknowledge this invasion. He refers to it as the situation that has developed. Truly Orwellian. But his people, his army, his commanders know they got stabbed and no one was looking. And Ukraine is also digging into this terrain, right? They have no intentions of leaving it. And the longer they are in occupation and the more their combat engineers are at work, the harder it's going to be for Russia, frankly, to take this terrain back. It's been quite enjoyable to watch.
And this is where we come to two key events on the horizon for Ukraine. And now, apart from things they cannot predict, such as the crumbling of the Russian economy, which could happen any day now. We've been saying that for 2 years, but it looks like it's on shaky ground. That's not something Ukraine can necessarily control. But there are two things that are inevitable, and they're on the horizon. One is winter, and the other one is the US election. So how important is the timing of the Kursk operation with these two things in mind? And what you've just said there, the apparent desire to dig in and remain.
Well, the rule of thumb is, if you are attacking someone and you want to drive them back, you need at least 3-to-1 numerical superiority. And that is the bare minimum. If you have troops and units that are trained to their utmost, troops trained to a very high standard, and their commanders trained to use all of the units and means at their disposal to conduct combined arms maneuver warfare, then you might get away with 3-to-1. In most cases, you want 4 or 5-to-1 and 10-to-1 at the point of contact. That's ideal. Russia can't really do that. They've shown that they're not capable of conducting large-scale ground maneuver warfare. So if we guesstimate that there are 10,000 Ukrainian troops in the area of Kursk, and it might be much higher than that, Putin's announcement that he has sent 30,000 troops into Kursk, it doesn't mean very much, especially when he said 10,000 of those troops used to be in the Air Force. So we're not talking about a crack mechanized brigade here. Regarding the election, I am afraid that the political class of the United States has totally taken their eye off Ukraine, and it won't come back to Ukraine until the inauguration in January. So I'm truly afraid that no one's really minding the ball here in the United States.
And this is perhaps also reflected in the electoral addresses we've seen. I mean, certainly Trump has surrounded himself with people, or he's been advised to surround himself with people who regurgitate Russian propaganda narratives on a regular basis. There's Vance and the others. And this very much reflects his first administration, when he was also surrounded by people like Flynn and Manafort, who were not simply regurgitating propaganda narratives, but there is compelling evidence that they may have been corrupted or in the pay of the Kremlin. So you've got these sort of signals and noises that don't look particularly great coming from the Trump campaign. We know that he himself probably has not formed a view on these things. He's liable to change his mind and be influenced by whoever has just whispered in his ear. So there's a high degree of real uncertainty on that side. On the other side, we've not heard anything that gives concern, but we've not heard anything specific or concrete. So what would you hope to hear from the candidates in the election, specifically about Ukraine, that would indicate to you that they take the idea of victory seriously and actually have some conception of what victory means and entails?
Well, the purpose of the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor, who heads the National Security Council, is to advise the president on military, geopolitical, and security matters. Those are the people that are supposed to give the president the best information to allow him or her to make the best possible decisions. That's just not happening now. And I try to stay as apolitical as I possibly can. But we've gotten to this bad position in Ukraine, frankly, because the commander-in-chief of the United States has not said to his national security advisor or to the Secretary of Defense, do what's necessary to win this war and give me a plan. No one has said that. So observers like me, and luckily I'm out of the Beltway loop now. I no longer have to make a living in the Beltway, so I can say that the emperor doesn't have any clothes on. It's the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who has taken this extraordinarily timid, if not negligent, course of action. I don't see how the national security interests of the United States are served by a long, brutal, destructive war in Ukraine. And I certainly don't see why we are skating so close to the pond of a Russian victory. What effect is that going to have on European security and American security going forward? Look, we know what Putin's going to do. He invaded Chechnya, he invaded Georgia, he invaded Moldova. He is an imperial expansionist despot. He compares himself to Peter the Great. Jonathan, if I told you I'm just like Peter the Great, you should call 999 and have them come talk to me. But this man has his grubby mitts on the levers of power. He has to be prevented from doing this to any one of his neighbors again. And frankly, look, the war is not going optimally for Ukraine. It's going atrociously for Russia. They've lost close to 700,000 dead in this war, 10,000 tanks. They are much like the United States in Vietnam in 1970. This is a war they're not going to win. But unfortunately, Ukraine still needs a tremendous amount of help, and we need to give it to them.
And this is where red lines come in, because I think what people following the war closely and who have a much clearer conception of what victory is, I think, valid and Ukraine is entitled to demand. One of those things, of course, is to take out and create some sense of security, and for an operation like Kursk to achieve its maximal impact. For that to happen, systems like ATACMS need to be authorized to be in use, not against Moscow and the Kremlin. That's not what Ukraine is asking for, but to take out the Shaheeds and ballistic missiles and the planes that deliver them at the launch points. And many of those launch points are not hugely distant from where Ukraine currently is digging into Russian territory. We're talking a couple of 100 kilometers distance. that would put most of these offensive airfields within range. These permissions, however, are not being provided. In your view, is there any military sense here, or is this entirely driven by some kind of political objective, which, as you say, is kind of opaque and doesn't really have any particular clarity behind it?
Well, I cannot understand. Let me put it this way. 40,000 people go to work in the Pentagon every morning. Everyone there knows exactly what it's going to take for Ukraine to turn the tide in this war. Just two things, and there are a score of things that have to come together, but just two pillars of their military success. One is adequate air defense. One of the reasons Putin keeps attacking civilian population centers is he is forcing Ukraine to take its limited air defense capabilities and pull them back into the cities. What that does is it's pushed this Hobson's choice onto Ukraine. It can either protect its civilians when they sleep in bed at night, or it can protect its frontline soldiers and protect their logistical ground lines of communication and supply. The second thing that Ukraine desperately needs is the ability to strike Russian targets, logistical targets, nodes of command and control, back away from the zero line. And it isn't just the shortage of ATACMS and long-range precision guided munitions. Every day, Russia fires between 30,000 and 60,000 rounds of artillery. On a good day, Ukraine will fire 6,000. Artillery is the king of battle. If you do not have artillery dominance, you are simply going to lose ground. That's Napoleon knew that. That's a gap that needs to be closed. And just those two deficiencies, Jonathan, only air defense and precision strike munitions, it puts Ukraine on the back foot.
And of course, we know the cost of that. We've seen videos from this weekend of the civilian casualties, and some of those images are truly heartbreaking and horrific. And the stories of some of those people who lost their lives. One was a young artist with incredible promise, with her life cut short. There was someone else just simply sitting on a park bench with her pet or out for a jog or something. And then there was a sports hall in central Kharkiv. So these strikes are taking place in the middle of the day, in broad daylight, on a weekend, in a site that is known to be frequented by civilians. These are obscene war crimes, aren't they? And we should be demanding from our politicians that they give a clear solution on how to resolve this.
You know, there is a bandwidth problem with international news. They will only cover so much. And besides the lack of prioritization of news from Ukraine, there is a major distraction. And that is the political circus going on in the United States. And we need to push this information from Ukraine a bit farther to the forefront. I'm certain we need to do that.
Well, I can hear the background music there. That probably means we should wrap up our conversation for now, I think. And I think this is the end of the recording. I'm hugely grateful to you for joining us for this episode today.